Have you ever felt like the market was against you? Like no matter what you do, it turns the moment you enter. Like every time you try to do the right thing, something inside you pushes you to do the opposite. This is not a story about the market. It's a story about what the market shows you. There was a trader who believed the problem was always outside. When he lost, it was the market. When he hesitated, it was uncertainty. When he broke his rules, it was because the setup wasn't clear enough. He always had a reason, something to point at, something to blame. And for a long time, that belief protected him. Because as long as the problem was outside, he didn't have to look inside. Every time he opened his charts, he focused only on price. Candles, patterns, movements. He studied them deeply. He tried to understand every move, predict every shift, find meaning in every signal. And sometimes it worked. He would catch a good trade, feel confident, and believe he was finally improving. But that confidence never lasted. Because the next trade would be different. He would hesitate, enter late, or exit too early. And once again, he would feel that frustration, that confusion, that quiet question in his mind. Why does this keep happening? At first, he thought he just needed more knowledge, more analysis, more tools on front of the charts. So he kept learning, kept watching, kept trying to master the market. But the more he learned, the more complicated things became. Because now he saw too much, too many signals, too many possibilities, too many reasons to act, and too many reasons not to. And in that noise, his decisions became heavier, slower, less certain. It wasn't clarity he was gaining, it was confusion. And without realizing it, he had moved further away from the real problem. Because the market was not confusing him, his mind was. Every trade he took carried something deeper than logic. It carried fear, the fear of being wrong. It carried hope, the desire to be right. It carried pressure, the need to win back what was lost. And all of that was invisible on the chart. But it was shaping every decision he made. When the setup appeared, he didn't just see an opportunity, he saw risk, doubt, and uncertainty. When the trade moved slightly against him, he didn't just see normal movement, he felt danger. And when price moved in his favor, he didn't feel calm, he felt urgency, like he had to secure the profit before it disappeared. The market wasn't doing anything different, but his reactions were. And that's when something started to shift. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but slowly, like a realization forming in the background. What if the problem wasn't the market at all? What if every hesitation, every early exit, every emotional decision was not caused by the chart, but revealed by it? He sat there one day, watching the screen, not trying to predict the next move, but trying to understand himself. And for the first time, he noticed something he had always ignored. The market didn't create his emotions, it exposed them. Every fear he felt was already there, every doubt, every impatience, every need for control. It was all inside him long before he entered the trade. The market simply gave it a moment to appear. And that's when he understood something most traders spend years avoiding. The market is not your enemy, it's a mirror. It reflects exactly who you are in that moment, your discipline, or your lack of it, your patience or your impulsiveness, your confidence or your fear. And once you see that clearly, you can no longer blame the market, because now the responsibility is yours. And that realization is where everything begins to change, but also where the real challenge starts. Not the charts, not the indicators, not the strategy, you. Because every time you enter a trade, you don't just bring your analysis with you. You bring your emotions, your fears, your expectations, and your past experiences. And the market simply reveals them. You might think you're reacting to price, but in reality, you're reacting to what you feel. A small pullback becomes fear. A slow move becomes doubt. A winning trade becomes pressure. And before you even realize it, your decisions are no longer based on your plan, they're based on your emotions. That's why two traders can look at the exact same chart, take the exact same setup, and get completely different results. One follows the plan calmly, accepts the risk, and lets the trade play out. The other hesitates, interferes, and exits early.
Not because the market changed, but because something inside him did. And that's the part most traders avoid. Because it's easier to say the market is unpredictable than to admit your reactions are. It's easier to change strategies than to face your own behavior. But the truth is simple and uncomfortable. You don't lose control because of the market, you lose control because you never had it. And once you see that clearly, something begins to shift. Not in the market, but in the way you approach it. You stop trying to predict every move, and you start paying attention to something more important, your own reactions. Because every hesitation is telling you something. Every early exit is showing you something. Every moment you break your rules is not random, it's a pattern that comes from within you. And if you ignore it, it repeats. Over and over again, in different trades, under different conditions, but with the same result. Not because the market is targeting you, but because you're bringing the same mindset into every trade. That's when you realize something most traders never truly accept. You are consistent, just not in the way you think. Consistent in hesitation, consistent in breaking rules, consistent in reacting emotionally, and that consistency is what creates your results. So if you want to change your results, you don't start with the market, you start with yourself. But that's where it becomes difficult, because changing yourself is harder than changing a strategy. It requires awareness, honesty, and the willingness to see things you've been avoiding. And most people don't want to do that. Because it means letting go of excuses, it means accepting responsibility, it means admitting that the results you're getting are a reflection of how you think and how you act. But once you accept that, you gain something powerful: control. Not over the market, but over yourself. And that's the only control that actually matters. Because when you control your reactions, your decisions become clearer. Your entries become cleaner. Your exits become more consistent. Not because the market became easier, but because you stopped making it harder. And slowly, trade by trade, decision by decision, you begin to notice a difference. Less hesitation, less emotional interference, more clarity, more discipline. Not perfect, but improving. And that improvement doesn't come from learning something new, it comes from seeing something clearly. That the market was never the problem. It was always reflecting you. And once you understand that, you stop fighting it and start learning from it. But even with that awareness, there is still a moment, a very specific moment, where most traders lose control again, even when they know exactly what they should do.
That moment comes right after you enter a trade, when everything becomes real. Before the entry, everything feels controlled. You see the setup, you understand the logic, and you feel ready. But the moment you click, something changes. The trade is now live, and suddenly your mind is no longer calm. It starts asking questions. What if this one fails? What if I'm wrong again? What if I lose this? And just like that, your focus shifts. You're no longer following your plan, you're reacting to your thoughts. The chart hasn't changed, but you have. A small movement against you feels bigger than it is. A few candles in the wrong direction start to feel like a threat, and even though your setup is still valid, you begin to doubt it. Not because the market gave you a reason, but because your mind did. So you interfere. You adjust your stop, you close early, you hesitate on decisions you already made before entering, and all of it feels justified in the moment. It feels like you're protecting yourself. But you're not. You're breaking your own structure. And that's where most traders don't realize what's happening. They think they are reacting to the market, but they are actually reacting to discomfort. The discomfort of uncertainty, the discomfort of not knowing what will happen next. And instead of accepting that discomfort, they try to control it. But trading doesn't reward control, it rewards acceptance. Because the moment you try to control every movement, you step outside your plan. And once you step outside your plan, you're no longer trading, you're just reacting. That's why discipline is not tested before the trade, it's tested during the trade. When things are unclear,
when the market slows down, when price moves against you. That's when your real mindset shows. Not in perfect conditions, but in uncomfortable ones. And if you pay attention, you'll start to notice something. The same reactions keep appearing. The same thoughts, the same fears, the same impulses. Different trades, same behavior. That's not random. That's who you are under pressure. And the market simply brings it out of you. So instead of asking, what is the market doing? You start asking a different question. What am I doing and why? Because that question shifts your focus from prediction to awareness. And awareness is where change begins. Not instantly, not perfectly, but gradually. You begin to catch yourself in those moments. The moment you feel the urge to close early, the moment you want to move your stop, the moment you want to take a trade that isn't part of your plan. And instead of acting immediately, you pause, just for a second. And in that second, you create space between your emotion and your action. That space is where control lives. Because now you have a choice. Follow the feeling or follow the plan. And every time you choose the plan, even when it feels uncomfortable, you build something stronger than any strategy. You build trust in yourself. Not confidence based on winning, but confidence based on execution. The kind of confidence that doesn't disappear after a loss because it's not tied to the outcome. It's tied to your behavior. And once that starts to grow, something interesting happens. The market no longer feels like a place where you are being tested. It starts to feel like a place where you are observing. You stop reacting to every movement. You stop needing every trade to work. You stop taking things personally because you understand something clearly now. The market is not judging you, it's revealing you. And the more honest you are with what it shows, the more you improve. But there is still one thing that makes this difficult, something subtle that pulls traders back into old habits even after they become aware of all this.
That thing is expectation. Not the obvious kind, not the one you say out loud, but the quiet expectation you carry into every trade. The one that tells you this trade should work, that this setup should win, that after everything you've learned, this one should finally go your way. And the moment you expect something from the market, you lose your balance. Because now you're no longer neutral. You're no longer just executing a plan. You're hoping, wanting, needing a specific outcome. And that need creates pressure. It's subtle at first. You don't notice it immediately, but it shows up in small ways. You watch the trade more closely than usual. You react faster than you planned. You feel tension when price doesn't move the way you expected. And slowly, that expectation turns into frustration. Because the market doesn't know what you expect. It doesn't adjust for your hopes, your timing, or your need to be right. It simply moves based on its own conditions. And when reality doesn't match your expectation, emotion steps in. That's when you start interfering again. Not because your system failed, but because your expectation wasn't met. You close early to protect yourself, or you hold too long trying to force the outcome. You break rules not out of ignorance, but out of emotional pressure. And then the cycle repeats. But once you see it clearly, once you recognize that expectation is what's pulling you out of your system, you can start to change it. You stop entering trades with the need to win. You start entering trades with the willingness to accept whatever happens. And that shift is powerful. Because now the trade is no longer a test of whether you're right or wrong. It becomes a process. A simple execution of rules, followed by observation. No pressure, no attachment, no need to control the outcome. Just discipline. And when you operate like that, something begins to settle inside you. The tension fades. The urgency disappears. You stop chasing results and you start focusing on consistency. Not consistency in winning, but consistency in behavior, because that's the only consistency that matters. And the more you repeat that behavior, the more stable you become. Losses don't shake you the same way. Wins don't excite you the same way. Everything becomes
neutral. Not because you don't care, but because you understand. You understand that one trade doesn't define you, one outcome doesn't change your process, and the market doesn't owe you anything. It never did. And that understanding removes the weight from your decisions. You no longer need to be right. You only need to be consistent. But even with that clarity, there is still one final challenge, a moment where everything you've learned, your system, your discipline, your awareness, is tested all at once.
That moment usually comes after a loss, or even after a few of them in a row. Not because the system stopped working, but because your mind starts questioning it. You followed your rules, you did everything correctly, and still, the outcome wasn't what you wanted. And that's where things become uncomfortable. Because now you can't blame yourself for breaking rules. You did your part, but the result still didn't reward you. And in that space, doubt begins to grow. Is this really working? Should I adjust something? Maybe I need to refine it. At first, it sounds logical. It feels like improvement. But if you look closely, it's not coming from clarity, it's coming from discomfort. The discomfort of losing, even when you did things right. And that's a very difficult place for most traders, because they're used to linking good behavior with good results. So when the result doesn't match the behavior, it creates confusion. But this is where a deeper level of understanding is required. Because in trading, doing the right thing does not guarantee a win. It guarantees consistency over time. And that difference is what most people struggle to accept. You can follow your system perfectly and still lose. Not because the system failed, but because one trade is just one outcome in a larger series. And if you judge your system based on a few results, you will always be tempted to change it too early. That's how traders slowly drift away from what works, not through big mistakes, but through small adjustments driven by doubt. And each adjustment feels justified. It feels like you're improving, like you're getting closer. But in reality, you're moving away from consistency. Because consistency requires stability, and stability requires trust. Not blind trust, but informed trust. Trust built from repetition, from observation, from seeing your system play out over time without interference. And that kind of trust doesn't come quickly. It comes from staying with your plan, even when it feels uncomfortable. From allowing results to unfold without trying to control them. From resisting the urge to fix something every time you experience a loss. Because not every loss is a problem. Some losses are just part of the process. And when you begin to see losses that way, not as failures, but as expected outcomes within a system, your relationship to trading starts to change. You become less reactive, less emotional, more grounded in your decisions. You don't rush to adjust things after a bad trade. You don't feel the need to prove yourself after a loss. You simply continue, following your rules, observing your behavior, and letting the system do its job. And over time, that approach creates something powerful: stability. Not the kind that comes from winning all the time, but the kind that comes from knowing exactly how you will behave regardless of the outcome. And once your behavior becomes stable, your results begin to reflect that stability. Not perfectly, but consistently enough to make progress. And that's when trading starts to feel different. Not like a constant struggle, but like a process you understand and can manage. And in that process, you begin to see something clearly. It was never about controlling the market. It was always about controlling yourself.
And once you start controlling yourself, something else becomes clear. You begin to notice how much of your past behavior was automatic, how many decisions were made without awareness, how often you reacted before you even had time to think. It's almost like you were trading on impulse, guided by emotions you didn't fully recognize in the moment. But now, that starts to change. You begin to slow down, not in the sense of missing opportunities, but in the way you process them. You see a setup, and instead of rushing, you observe. You check your conditions. You remind yourself of your rules, and most importantly, you check yourself. How am I feeling right now? Because you've learned that your state matters just as much as the setup. A good trade taken in the wrong mindset can still lead to a bad decision, and a simple question like that can prevent mistakes that used to feel unavoidable. So you pause more often, not out of fear, but out of control. And in that pause, you start to recognize patterns you never saw before. The urge to enter too early when you're excited, the hesitation when you're unsure, the need to recover quickly after a loss. These patterns were always there, but now you see them as they happen. And that awareness gives you something powerful: choice. Because once you see the pattern, you're no longer trapped in it. You can decide whether to follow it or break it. And every time you choose to break it, even in a small way, you begin to change your behavior. Not instantly, but progressively. You don't become perfect overnight. There are still moments where emotions rise, where old habits try to take control, but the difference now is that you notice them sooner. You catch yourself before things go too far. And even when you make a mistake, you understand it better. You don't just feel it, you learn from it. And that changes how you move forward. Instead of reacting with frustration, you reflect. Instead of blaming the market, you analyze your behavior. You start asking better questions. Not why did I lose, but did I follow my process? Not what went wrong in the market, but what went wrong in my execution. And those questions lead to better answers, because now your focus is in the right place. You're no longer chasing outcomes, you're refining behavior. And the more you refine that behavior, the more natural it becomes. Following your rules starts to feel less forced. Discipline starts to feel less like effort and more like habit. You don't have to constantly remind yourself what to do, you simply do it. And when you reach that point, trading becomes quieter. Less noise in your mind, less urgency in your actions, less emotional weight in every decision. You're still engaged, still focused, but no longer overwhelmed. You operate with clarity. And from that clarity, better decisions come. Not perfect decisions, but consistent ones. The kind that over time builds something stable, something sustainable. And that's when you begin to understand the real progression of a trader. It doesn't move from strategy to strategy, it moves from awareness to control to consistency. And each step depends on the one before it. If you skip awareness, you never see the problem. If you skip control, you can't change the behavior. And without consistent behavior, there are no consistent results. So the work you're doing now, the awareness you're building, the discipline you're practicing, it's not small. It's the foundation of everything that comes after. And once that foundation is strong, everything else becomes easier to build on.
And when you reach that point, you finally see trading for what it really is. Not a battle against the market, but a process of mastering yourself within it. Because the charts were never the hardest part, the indicators were never the challenge. The real challenge was always you, your reactions, your habits, your ability to stay consistent when it matters most. And once you accept that fully, something changes in the way you approach every trade. You stop trying to prove something. You stop trying to be right. You stop needing every trade to work. Instead, you focus on something much simpler, but far more powerful: execution. You see your setup, you check your rules, you accept the risk, and you act. No hesitation, no second guessing, no emotional interference. Not because you're certain of the outcome, but because you're certain of your process. And that's where real confidence comes from. Not from winning, but from knowing that you can trust yourself to do the right thing regardless of the result. Because results will always vary. Some trades will win, some will lose, and some will do nothing. That will never change. But what can change is how you show up for each trade. And that's what separates a struggling trader from a consistent one. One chases outcomes, the other commits to behavior. So if you've been feeling stuck, if you've been searching, doubting, switching, and wondering why nothing seems to work, understand this clearly. You don't need more information, you need more awareness. You don't need a better strategy, you need better control. And you don't need the market to change, you need to change how you respond to it. Because the moment you take responsibility for your behavior, everything becomes clearer. Your decisions become simpler, your process becomes stronger, and your progress becomes real. So the next time you sit in front of your charts and you feel that urge to react, to rush, to control what you can't control, pause for a moment and ask yourself one question. Am I reacting to the market or am I following my process? Because that one question, answered honestly, is where everything begins to change. And if you can stay with that, if you can keep choosing your process over your emotions again and again, you won't just become better at trading, you'll become consistent.